So on part two of this lecture, and normally I don't go this long, but I'm going a little longer today because this is sort of some foundational principles. But we're almost done. And I'm going to talk about liberalism. And the idea of the word liberalism really in context is to be free, the idea of freedom. And it sounds great to say, and it sounds like, wow, freedom sounds wonderful. But there's always an interesting question there. Can you have too much freedom? And that's a very complicated question because if everybody had ultimate freedom and no institutional controls, no government in place, then you would have anarchy. And then the question is whose freedom is more important than your freedom? So perhaps there's really no way to really truly be free, whether you're the richest or the poorest. If you're the richest, people are trying to get where you are, so they may impinge on your freedom. And if you're poor, then your idea of trying to not be poor may push you to do things that will impinge on other people's freedoms. So that's a question of human nature, and that's more in the political philosophy kind of stuff. So, but under the idea of classical liberals, the idea is what it means to have total freedom and have virtually little or no government. And as I mentioned, if you have no government, you have anarchy. If you have a little government, then you need some kind of framework to be able to work with them to have society be able to address its needs, whether it be food, shelter, clothing, money, jobs, and some organizational framework to distribute those things to the people. And then reform liberals basically is like a modernized version, and basically believes that the government should protect the rights and help those who are struggling. And basically minimize the gap between the rich and the poor. And that also may perhaps be altruistic, particularly in the world we live in today. And when I say altruistic, I mean like it may be like the ideal version of society, but the question is whether it could ever really happen and exist. And so, but under the auspices of liberalism, it kind of takes a positive view of human beings and human nature, and it basically, believes that human beings are basically good, and they should have the choice to pursue their dreams if they want to without any impediments. It doesn't look at inequality in the way that the conservatives look at it, where they kind of say the conservatives say there are those who are better than others in society, and those who are the better should control and run the system. Well, liberalism tends to take the other side of that and say everybody should have equal opportunity to pursue their dreams. It's up to you entirely whether you actually get there, but they should actually be able to open the door to pursue if they so choose. So under this umbrella of liberalism is the notion of democracy. And democracy, and certainly when we talk about the issue of Democrats, is certainly based on the root of liberalism, just like conservatism is based on the conservative side of the aisle as well. So you have Democrats and Republicans. So Republicans are considered conservative, liberals are considered Democrats, and of course there are those across the spectrum, and those in the middle are called moderates. So you could be somewhere stuck in the middle where most people are. And then the other idea about this is, the idea of different types of democracy. So we have direct democracy, meaning we the people, like one person, one vote. We directly vote for our representatives, our people who make decisions in our society. And the other type is representative, which is basically we vote for somebody who represents our interests. So when you have people who represent your interests, it's not like you individually are voting for that one person. Like, so if we had a popular vote where you voted for the president, for example, and your vote counted for the president, that would be a direct democracy, or your vote directly counted for one individual. That's direct democracy. If you were voting for a representative, which typically happens at state and national level, those are the people that you vote for. You're voting for people who represent your interests at higher levels of government. And so, again, under the liberal ideology, the idea of human rights, that we're all entitled to certain rights which are protected by the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. You see a few of them listed there, like the right to free speech and freedom of worship and freedom of press, etc. And these rights, I would argue, are, whether you may have rights, I always tell people rights are in the eyes of the beholder, who has power. So you may think you have the right to free speech, but there have been numerous occasions where free speech has been challenged and people have been harmed or screwed over because the government felt that your idea of free speech wasn't what their idea of free speech is. So just because you think you have them doesn't mean they're always protected. In fact, Benjamin Franklin famously said at one point in history that those that would give up their civil liberties or their Bill of Rights, basically for a little peace and security, deserve neither. That you're never supposed to give up your rights as a citizen because you're afraid or because you think the government's going to protect you. They don't have the right to do that, even though most people don't know that. So we have to be careful about, especially in democracy. And it was famously said by a famous sociologist that we in a democracy have to constantly discuss and analyze the amount of power that is available to be used against us, even by our own government and institutions. So when you have big business and money that control the system, then your chances of being basically repressed go up more because they are the ones who are basically dictating the policies that government comes out with. Okay, let's move on to the next one. And the next one is conservatism. And again, conservatism, the base root of the word is to conserve, and it's to save, right? To hang on to traditions, to protect society from changes that can happen over time. They kind of look at society as being like fads. So like just because things come and go doesn't mean that you have to follow along with them. And they're very strong on moral issues, so particularly those that are of public concern. So they talk about the issue of abortion, pornography, and same-sex marriage because they look at them as not being part of tradition. This is one of the struggles with conservatism and truth, is that sometimes, in trying to hold on to traditions, you may be holding on to things that no longer serve the interests of the people, or the world may never look like that again. So the idea of looking backwards while the world is moving forward means you can easily bump into the wall if you're not careful. And that's not to say that they're not important tenets in conservative ideology and that they're not important tenets in tradition. It just means that we have to be able to balance those with the things that are going to change and never go back to being what they were. It's like letting the genie out of the bottle. You can never put the genie back in the bottle again. Unless you're Aladdin, right? You can rub the lamp or whatever. They also believe in economic freedom, but not necessarily intellectual freedom. So what this means is they believe that basically whoever controls the economics is there because they deserve to be there, and because they have economic freedom. The more economic freedom you have, the more freedom you actually have under conservative ideology. And those that don't have any money basically get controlled by those who do. And there are inherent winners and losers under conservative ideology and conservative thinking. But then intellectual freedom means that they don't believe that everybody should attain the same level or same goal, that there are people who are, intellectually superior to others, and therefore those people should have greater say in what happens in society. And then, again, this idea of sort of the traditional aspect is why conservatives tend to like authoritarian systems, they tend to like the idea of monarchies, and really rooted in the idea of patriotism based on traditional ideologies, just like we're coming up on the 4th of July, and the idea of how people can sort of follow things without questioning is what they call your patriotism, even though I would argue it may be antithetical to democratic principles, because just like on 4th of July, everyone wasn't free on the 4th of July. If you were a person of color, if you were a woman, if you were poor and white, you were not free on 4th of July. The country may have been free from Britain, but you weren't free. So there's always these subjective ideas about the idea of freedom, and under these different ideologies, this is how it's sort of framed. Okay, let's move on. And then under fascism, which basically is the idea of really authoritarianism, quasi-nationalism, militarism. It's all these anti-anarchy. So basically, having strong state structures, strong controls, strong on being able to pressure society to make sure it follows the functions that is set forth by the leader. That basically the role of each person in the society is to serve the state and the person who runs the state. So like under totalitarianism, which is a function of fascism, it means you have one individual who has total control of the entire state, almost like having an emperor or a king who basically dictates the outcome and everything that happens in your society. So they use the example of course, Benito Mussolini in Italy, of course, Adolf Hitler. You could look at North Korea and other areas where you also have leaders that are institutionalized as like almost like demigods. Same in China, same with Putin in Russia, even though they call themselves, sometimes they call themselves democracies. They're anything but democracies. They just say it because it makes them feel good, but the truth, Putin has total control in Russia, and that's the way it is. So there's basically no civil liberties and very little freedoms. It's very racist in its ideology. It's almost like Hitler with the Aryan race, where he basically says that the white Aryans, which are not really Aryans, he borrowed them from the Persians and created this kind of myth about white, Greek god-looking people, and they were the ones that were the historical, Aryans, which is not true, but nonetheless, people followed because of the state of the situation in Germany after World War I, for example, when it was poor and people were struggling and looking for somebody to help them believe in what they were again. So again, here's an example of the spectrum from communism to fascism. You can see basically where you have from less economic freedom to more economic freedom to more government involvement, less government involvement. Then economic inequality to individualism. So you can see where just on the spectrum, and then ask yourself this question: where do you fit in there? Where do you, based on what you know now, and then, after you do some rethinking and reviewing, maybe you evolve on this question, and maybe your view has changed. Maybe how you see yourself is not what you saw yourself at before. Okay, so that's it for the isms, and then we will move on into next week, into week 4. And you guys have a great day. All right.